Good afternoon and welcome to the first in a series of BBC Scotland webcasts. Every fortnight we'll be putting your questions about Scotland's futures to key figures and decision makers. And I'm joined today by Blair Jenkins, the Chief Executive of the Yes Scotland Independence Campaign. He's no stranger to a TV studio, having previously been Head of News here at BBC Scotland and also at STV. He's also written about the future of newspapers and set out a plan for a Scottish TV channel. So, Blair, thanks very much indeed for coming in. As I say, these are questions submitted by readers of the BBC Scotland News website. Let's start on something close to home for you. It's about broadcasting. It's a question that's come from Paul Lucker, asking what will happen to BBC Scotland after independence? What will happen to the licence fee? And will BBC cease to be the British Broadcasting Corporation?
Broadcasting, I think, is one of the most exciting areas when we look ahead to what an independent Scotland will be like. Scotland at that point will continue to receive all the programmes and services that people are used to receiving from the BBC and from other broadcasters. But in addition, I think there'll be far more Scottish content, more Scottish programmes, and we know, I know from the research we've done, there's a huge demand in Scotland for a broader range of programmes than we get currently. So just going through the items that Paul mentioned, yes, the BBC services will continue to be available. There will obviously have to be a new arrangement between the BBC and the new Scottish Government and any broadcasting authority on the terms and conditions under which the BBC broadcasts in Scotland. But the one thing you can be absolutely sure of, Douglas, is that right now the BBC will be doing their scenario planning for what happens in the event of Scotland voting yes, as I believe we will.
They say they're not, but you think they will behind the scenes?
Yes, they are behind the scenes planning for what would happen when Scotland votes yes. And there's no doubt that there will be a deal to be struck under which all the BBC's programmes and services will continue to be broadcast here. To what extent the licence fee revenue raised in Scotland is allocated to, partly allocated to the BBC, partly allocated to a new Scottish public service broadcaster, those would be the subjects for negotiation. But I would
imagine all the channels and radio will be available throughout Scotland as well as the rest of
That's what the BBC will want, it's what the Scottish Government would want, and also, frankly, it's what the Government of the rest of the UK will want when Scotland is independent. They will very much wish to have that connection and to have the BBC still broadcasting here. It's a very important point to remember, of course, that we're not just consumers of the BBC here in Scotland, we are part owners of the BBC. So Scotland part funded everything and anything the BBC has done up till now. So all the intellectual property rights and significant developments like the iPlayer, which is how a lot of people watch programmes nowadays. Now, it's sometimes said inaccurately by the No campaign that the iPlayer would not be available in Scotland when we're independent. This is clearly palpable nonsense. We are part owners of the iPlayer. We funded, in part, the development of the iPlayer. So all those services people are used to will still be available in an independent Scotland.
But if there's extras for a Scottish broadcasting channel, do you think Scots will have to pay a bit more on the licence fee?
There would be no appetite in Scotland for a bigger licence fee than presently. So the issue would be how the current licence fee is allocated as between a new Scottish public service broadcaster, which I think would be required, and whether there's still a case for part of the licence fee going to the BBC. So those are the areas in which I believe there would be negotiation. But across a whole range of policy areas, when we vote yes, there will be negotiation. Frankly, I think broadcasting will be one of the easier issues to resolve. I don't think it's going to be one of the tricky ones.
Well, let's look at one that's could be quite tricky. It's Europe. We started close to home, broader sweep here. We may be heading towards a referendum on UK membership of the European Union, depending on what happens in politics at Westminster. Yeah. That would be after the vote we're facing Scotland in 2014. Here's a question from James Creerer. What is the point in trying to break free from England to surrender ourselves to the European Union?
Well, I think the thing about this, the European issue is, when Scotland is independent, if there is a case to be made for withdrawing from the European Union, if there's a political party that wants to put forward that point of view, it's not a point of view I would agree with, but if any political party wants to put forward that point of view, then of course they do so. That's democracy. And if there's a feeling, a significant feeling from any political grouping in Scotland when we're independent that we ought not to be in the European Union, then the normal business of democracy is you put that in a manifesto, you try to get yourself elected. If you get elected, then you go ahead and hold a referendum. I actually think that's highly unlikely in an independent Scotland. But the interesting thing is, of course, I think any objective commentator now would accept that the greater risk to Scotland right now of not continuing to be in membership of the European Union is if we stay in the UK. not if we become an independent country. That's becoming clearer by the day.
But this question is put by Peter Vincent rather differently. In the event of Scotland becoming independent from the rest of the UK, is the plan to be a standalone country like Norway or Switzerland, or would independence have to mean joining the UK and the single currency? If it's the latter, in the EU with the single currency, it's not really looking much like independence at all.
Well, we know as a matter of fact that Scotland cannot be compelled to join the euro once we are an independent country. We will continue in membership of the European Union. From a position of being within the European Union, terms and conditions of membership will have to be negotiated. But it is very, very clear.
You're saying Scotland will, or let's say Scotland would, with a yes vote, remain a member of the European Union? Sure.
Yes, because what would happen is, and I think this has been made very clear, very helpfully, just before the end of the year by David Edward, who's the most distinguished expert on the European rules and regulations, if you like, that we have in Scotland. What has to happen at the point when we vote yes, legally, in good faith, the European Union at that point has to begin negotiations with Scotland on the terms and conditions of Scotland's continuing membership. There will be an 18-month period between voting yes and the date of independence, during which time it will be easy, or rather it will be possible for all the terms and conditions of continuing membership to be resolved.
Well, there's a big claim. It would be easy, and you corrected that to possible to resolve all of these. Nobody thinks it's going to be easy.
Which is why I corrected myself. But it's certainly doable in that time. And I think, again, if you think about the fundamental narrative of the No campaign, is this assumption that the rest of the world will want to make life difficult for a newly independent Scotland, that we'll be emerging into a hostile environment where people will behave irrationally towards us. The truth is that the rest of Europe will be very keen to have Scotland as a member of the European Union, and we will be negotiating our new terms and conditions from the position of being inside, and that's very clear. It is also very clear that there can be no compulsion, because we can look at what's happened with other countries. There can be no compulsion about joining the euro. Now, it may be, again, democracy is democracy. At some point in the future, it could be that a political party in Scotland wishes to suggest membership of the euro currency, and again, at that point, that's something to be put to the people in a referendum, and if Scotland wants to join the euro, it can. At the point at which we vote for independence, Scotland will continue to use the pound. We will continue to be part of the sterling zone, that currency zone. At a future point, if something else looks more appropriate, then we can make that decision.
Well, you mentioned one very eminent lawyer. Anybody else can bring along other lawyers to give different opinions, because it's not terribly clear. Here's a question from Keith Coates. The Yes campaign claimed that Scotland would gain automatic entry into the European Union. Yet how do we know this is correct? Is there any new solid evidence from the European Commission that says Scotland would gain automatic entry? You're saying that David Edward offers that? Others are saying otherwise.
Well, the important point which David Edward makes, and to be honest, which we've been making for some time, is that this is not a legal decision. It will not be a legal decision.
It's a political decision.
There is nothing in the European treaties which covers the scenario that we're looking at here, where Scotland votes to become independent. So the reality is, which is why opinions from people in the European Commission or elsewhere are not legally founded. This will be a political decision. It will be a political matter, and I think one of the reasons why I'm glad we have the duration of the referendum campaign that we have, and plenty of time to sweep aside some of the fear tactics, to sweep away some of the roadblocks that people try to put in the way of Scotland voting for independence, is that we can reassure people that the political reality is that there will be a great desire to have Scotland in continued membership of the European Union.
Part of that reassurance is that whenever the question of negotiations comes up, and you've raised this already, there's a sort of frankly quite naive assumption that negotiations will go the way Scotland wants them to go, and that there wouldn't be any pushback, that Whitehall will say, of course Scotland can have whatever it wants. It's not going to work that way, is it?
Are you talking about negotiations with the rest of the UK? Or
the UK, Europe, and future of the BBC we've already raised?
Yeah, well, that's true. You cannot, life is uncertain to that extent. You cannot predict exactly how negotiations will go. I think the point I would make is there is every reason to suspect that the institutions of the European Union and indeed the rest of the UK, once Scotland votes to be independent, will act in enlightened self-interest. In other words, the European Union will wish to have Scotland in continued membership, in part because of the fact that we have 25% of Europe's offshore tidal and wind renewable energy, partly because of the oil that we have, but for all sorts of other reasons. a mature democracy like Scotland, which has been in continued membership of the European Union and complying with all the conditions of membership for 40 years. I mean, we look like a gold-plated member of the European Union. Why on earth would they not wish us to be members? As far as the negotiations with the rest of the UK go, I believe that, again, at the point at which it becomes clear, and this may be before referendum day, at the point at which it becomes clear on or before the referendum that Scotland is heading for independence, the interests of the rest of the UK, as with Scotland, will be in really very, very good, harmonious and positive relations around these islands, covering everything, covering currency, covering defence, covering the free movement of trade. Well, yes, which would be in having good and harmonious relations right around these islands, as we have with Ireland, for instance. So there is no doubt that the scenario which the No campaign tried to paint of hostility and divisiveness, that's not, I think, a likelihood. It's not a scenario that I recognise, and it's not how it's going to turn out.
Let's move on. We had quite a lot of questions put to you when we said online that you were coming along, about people's personal finance, some of them very specific questions. You're not qualified as a financial advisor, by the way, are you?
Only in an amateur sense.
Radio. I think we should remember asset valuations can go down as well as up. Yeah. I'm not qualified either, but let's have a look at what Billy McCain has been asking about where tax would get paid. He says, my question is fairly straightforward. It's about pensions. Never trust a man who says that pensions are going to be straightforward. Yeah. But his private pension is paid from England. How will you differentiate who pays tax to which government? If there are different rates on either side of the border, would he pay English rates of tax or Scottish rates?
Well, I think the key thing about a private pension is that, and I think this is probably the main point people would want to reassurance on, is that the contract with the pension provider remains the same. So it's not affected by the fact that Scotland is independent. You would continue to receive your private pension from your pension supplier in exactly the same way. I imagine the tax regime that would apply would be the one that applies in Scotland. That would seem to me to be the logical state of affairs.
Because that's where Billy lives.
But it's a very important point to say this, because a lot of people would have asked me that question, for instance, about public sector pensions, and I don't know if you're going to move on to public sector pensions, but the Scottish Government have guaranteed that public sector pensions would continue as currently. But it's a key point to make is that already a very large percentage of the public sector pensions paid in Scotland are actually run under Scottish schemes, so that the NHS pensions in Scotland, for instance, and the school teacher pension arrangements, those are already run and administered from within Scotland. So in Scotland we already have the situation where hundreds of thousands of public sector pensions are funded, are administered in Scotland, and that system will run very, very smoothly post-independence. Let me
tell you about Asif Anwar. He pays UK tax instead of tax in the USA, where he's a citizen. He's actually Scottish-born, but he's a citizen of the USA. Now, the USA is pointing out it has a tax treaty with the UK, ensuring people don't have to pay tax twice. But of course there's no tax treaty with an independent Scotland, and he fears that he may be exposed to double taxation. There's yet more negotiations to take place there on many tax treaties around the world.
Well, you're right, and that's the detailed work will have to be done on this and a range of other things. I think my general point here would apply, and I don't pretend I can give an absolutely immediate answer to that point, because it's quite a specific point. But there is no reason to believe that these matters cannot be resolved for Scotland, as they have been for lots of other independent countries. We are part of an international trend. At the end of the Second World War, there were about 50 independent countries in the world. There are now about 200. The long-term trend is towards self-determination of nations, and as part of that process, nations make sure that the arrangements they've inherited and the arrangements they take forward work very well for everybody. There's no reason to think it would be otherwise.
OK, R.P. James says, like many Scots, I have bonds with National Savings and Investments, which is underwritten by the UK government. Since you have to have a UK address to hold these national savings bonds, will this R.P. James be compelled to relinquish them under the plans for independence?
I think that would be part of I'm sure those ongoing arrangements would be resolved between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. I don't see any reason why they would be disadvantaged when Scotland votes for independence.
OK, on benefits, staying with personal finance issues, Ed Hunter says he's a pensioner living in Scotland. What does the Yes Scotland campaign have to say about the direct benefits that Ed's wife and Ed enjoy, such as free bus travel in Scotland, free medicine prescriptions, winter fuel heating allowance? Can all of these things be afforded?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's a very key distinction. I think it's one of the strongest arguments for independence. Is I do think we take a different view in Scotland about having decent levels of public provision and the provision of public services. So those things would continue. It's again, it's a statistical fact that all of the pension and welfare benefits that we have in Scotland are currently constitute a smaller percentage of our economy than they do in the UK economy. So, for instance, the total cost of pension and welfare benefits in Scotland relative to the total tax revenues raised in Scotland is about 40% of the tax revenues raised within Scotland. At a UK level, it's 42%. So we actually currently spend a smaller percentage of our national wealth, if you like, in terms of government revenues than the whole of the UK. So pensions and welfare benefits in an independent Scotland would be more affordable than they are currently with the UK regime.
That may be part of the answer to a question that's come from Ginny Allen. We're broadening this out to the economy more widely. Will the grant for the elderly for winter fuel bills still be paid? Answered that, I think. I'm very sceptical, says Ginny Allen, that Scotland is going to be financially viable in being able to provide health, NHS, military, etc. Where is the money going to come from? This is a question you must get quite often.
I think only because it comes up a lot, and I understand why it's asked, because there has been an attempt for many years to present a false picture of the Scottish economy, and the Scottish economy somehow underperforms the rest of the UK. The good thing is that we now have the official figures. We now have detailed accounts on this, so spanning a period now of many years, to demonstrate, particularly in recent years, that the Scottish economy outperforms the UK economy. And that's true of the last 5 years for which we have official figures, that the Scottish economy outperforms the UK economy.
Less true if you take a longer period.
Well,
unclear if you take the next 5 to 10
Well,
years.
we had the startling news from the UK Treasury just at the beginning of the year. They looked over a 12-year period and said that over a 12-year horizon, an independent Scotland relative to the UK economy, everyone in Scotland would have been £1 a year worse off. Now, we had an overwhelming response when this revelation emerged from the Treasury, which was to say, well, if independence would only cost us £1 a year. We don't accept the analysis, by the way, but even the UK Treasury analysis is that independence would only cost each Scot an average of £1 a year. On that basis, people said, we want to take it. The key thing about that finding, that report from the UK Treasury, is that there is strong polling evidence that if people in Scotland believe they will be no worse off under independence, then opinion shifts very heavily in favour of independence, which is why that was such an important concession from the Treasury.
Now, of course, all of this arithmetic around the public finances depends on a share, a big share of the oil revenue that's currently going into the Treasury. So here's a question from David Doherty. Given that a large number of oil fields in Scottish waters will be coming to the end of their lives within the next few years, how realistic is it for an independent Scotland to expect a constant stream of revenue from the oil sector?
Well, the expert analysis, or the expert prediction, is that there are at least 40 years of very healthy revenues from the oil fields which would fall to Scotland when we're independent. So oil is not the be-all and end-all of the Scottish economy, and we can talk about, and I know this is your area of expertise, we can't talk about other sectors which are very, very strong and which will develop in the future. But the great thing about oil, again, which is sometimes presented by the other side as almost a problem for Scotland, the oil revenues, it gives us a fantastic underpinning. It gives us a fantastic basis on which to build a strong, modern, successful economy. So we know that there are, £1 trillion worth of oil reserves still to be exploited. We know that new technology is meaning that more and more oil is recoverable.
But with higher tax breaks.
Well, yeah,
if you watch what the Treasury is doing at the moment, they're managing to get more exploration and production so long as they give higher tax breaks. That's not good news in the arithmetic.
Well, that's right. And the other key factor in this, of course, is the price of oil, and there is volatility in the price of oil. But that is true over a period of time. These things will even out. Some years oil will be more, some years it will be less. But oil is a fantastic resource for Scotland. I think we can be very, very confident about the future health of the Scottish economy. can I just go back just ever so slightly, Douglas, on the series of detailed questions you had on personal finance? Because I would accept that, I perhaps wasn't given the detail in some of these questions.
I wasn't giving you the time. But,
and to be honest, I don't have the detail on some of those points. Some of those are quite precise points on bonds and things. I'm in the fortunate position, since I'm not a politician, I don't have to pretend to have an answer to every question. But what I can certainly do for the people who've written in with those questions is I will go away and get the answers to those questions and hopefully provide the kind of detail that people were looking for in those precise points. But I hope I can be very reassuring, and have been very reassuring on pension provision, what happens with pensions, whether you're in a private pension scheme or a public sector pension scheme, and on the broader economy and the health of oil revenues going forward. I think there's a very, very strong story to tell, which should give people in Scotland real confidence.
Let's look at the other side of this economic or public finance coin, the cost of what's being proposed here. Alistair Simpson asks, how much will it cost to set up government departments such as, I'm going to take a deep breath here, Defence, Foreign Affairs, Home Affairs, Trade and Industry, Energy, Transport, Social Security, Employment, Professional Regulations, Health and Medicine, Media and Culture, and other bodies such as Ordnance Survey, asks Alistair. Where is the money going to come from for all of that? Now, the point he's making here is, I think that smaller countries, the sort of unit cost, or they can't spread costs across a big population the way that you can with the UK. The other point behind this, he's not spelling it out, but I will for you, the transition cost, the cost of setting up all of these different bodies could be very significant.
Yes, but again, I think you have to look at what we pay currently. Scotland currently pays, roughly speaking, £50 million a year towards the costs of all the various government departments which are based in London. If you think about the fact that what we'll be doing in setting up the infrastructure of an independent country is bringing an enormous number of high-value jobs into Scotland, high-value jobs which are currently located in London. So there'll be an immediate employment boost in Scotland from the fact that we will be creating the institutions of an independent state. We will stop paying £50 million, which is going elsewhere, and we'll spend money on the infrastructure of government here. The other the other major saving which will kick in right away, of course, is the £250 million a year we'll save from not having to pay towards Trident. So the institutions of government are eminently affordable in an independent Scotland, and the money and the jobs that go along with government departments, civil servants and all those departments that were mentioned, those jobs and that money will be in the Scottish economy. It's an important point, and I think one that we'll be making more and more this year. When you look around the world, it is very clear that the most successful economies in the world are small economies, and that's becoming more and more true with the passing of time. Smaller countries, smaller economies are more nimble, they're able to adapt much more quickly. There's a greater coherence and unity of purpose. All the evidence is, if you look at the top 10 countries in the world and the top 10 economies in terms of GDP per head, they are small countries, many of them smaller countries than Scotland.
But are you saying that the government they may be more nimble and effective and faster growing? You're making that point. Can government be as efficient? Because what you're describing sounds a bit like a big bureaucracy moving north of the border, and we're going to have our own bureaucracy. It doesn't necessarily sound very attractive to everybody.
Well, I think it's a smaller bureaucracy. Clearly, you would not replicate the size of governmental infrastructure that the UK has, and everything that we do would be subject to, cost-benefit analysis and those things. I'm not advocating big government. That would never be something I would necessarily advocate. I think what I'm saying is that there are a number of jobs, many of them high-value jobs, associated with governmental departments. Those jobs would be in Scotland. They would not be in London.
Let's stick with the economy on this question of how would Scotland have dealt, this is from Jeremy Munday, I should say. I don't know whether he's starting south or north of the border. You can make your own mind up. How would Scotland have dealt with the financial crisis if it had been independent? Will the Scottish state assume the debt taken on to rescue Royal Bank of Scotland and Halifax Bank of Scotland? That's just over 4 years ago. How would the fate of the country have been any different to Ireland's?
Well, I think a key point is we might very well not have had the financial crisis had Scotland been independent. I think it's a key point, it's not made often enough, that all of us in Scotland were depending upon the UK government and the UK financial regulator to be doing their jobs and not to have allowed what did happen to happen.
Now, are you saying that Scottish politicians were saying you're being far too tough on these banks, or were they actually saying that there was gold-plated regulation going on?
What I'm saying is
a lighter touch regulation.
What I'm saying is, I think everyone in Scotland, whatever their view was, I mean, and they might not have known the detail of what the banks were up to, the casino banking that we now know about. But I think what all of us in Scotland were entitled to assume was that the UK government and the UK financial regulator were looking after our interests. Now, it turns out they were actually asleep at the wheel, and we did have the financial crisis of several years ago, and Scotland is still paying the price for negligence at a UK level. We are still paying the price in Scotland in terms of jobs being lost, services being cut. Many of the hardship measures that are being forced through now, which are proving so difficult and so hugely unpopular in Scotland, are as a result of the fact that our interests were not being looked after by the UK government and the UK financial regulator. Now,
my memory is of Alex Salmond saying that there should be lighter touch regulation, or at least as light touch regulation as Westminster was.
And I'm sure lots of other politicians are saying the same thing. My point remains, Douglas, that we were placing our trust in the UK government and the UK financial regulator, who did not look after our interests. And I believe that had Scotland been independent, as a smaller country, we would have been paying closer attention. It's not to say it necessarily wouldn't have happened, but at least in a sense you make your own mistakes. You don't pay the huge price of the mistakes other people made on your behalf.
Well, let's go back to Jeremy's question.
On the banking question, yeah.
Would the Scottish state assume the debt taken on to rescue RBS? And
the international precedent for banking debts, when things like this happen, is that the proportion of the debt which is attributed to any one country depends on where the area of operation of the bank was. Now, 90% of the activities of RBS was in London. I think RBS, people know the broad history of what happened. RBS in its corporate banking bought into the City of London culture, the anything goes casino culture, with the results that we now all know about. But in terms of where the burden lies, then the division of burden, and this has happened with the banks because the United States picked up some of the debt burden of RBS because of RBS activities in that country. So 90% of the activities were in the UK. But the total net, and you'll know these figures even better than I do, Douglas, because it's your area of expertise. I think the net cost of the bank bailout in the UK ended up being £66 billion. Scotland would have to pay a per capita share of that total
the answer
deficit.
to Jeremy Mundy is no. Scotland would not assume all of those debts. They'd be shared around.
Of RBS, we'd have to. My view, and I think this is the right view, is we would pay our population share of the inherited liability, the inherited deficit bailout.
OK, rattling through a few questions. We don't have long left. Here's a question from Dave Stephen. If Scotland gains independence, are all Scots then obliged to take a Scottish passport? Or is the option open to retain a UK passport? I'll add to that one from Scott Watson. Would Scottish-born people who live in England be able to apply for a Scottish passport?
Yes and yes is my view, and I'm sure that's what's been said.
You could hold a Scottish and a rest of UK passport, and you can live in England and have a Scottish passport if you're born here. That's
my understanding, Douglas. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Okay,
and I'm sure some people would want to have both. Some people would want one and not the other.
To try to cram in as many questions as we can. Here's a question about who can vote. It comes from Charlie Carlo. Why are over 400,000 English, Welsh, Irish, Polish, Australian, Dutch and any other nationality allowed to vote while over 800,000 Scots living outside Scotland are not? That's Charlie's number, not mine, but you get the point.
Yeah, and this is in line with international precedent. It is always the case that a vote on independence held in any country is a vote for those who are resident and on the electoral register in that country. And there is no political party suggesting that the franchise for this independence referendum should be anything other than those who are resident in Scotland and entitled to vote in Scotland.
But the question keeps coming up. I mean, you must recognise there's a lot of exiled Scots pretty disappointed that they don't have a say in their future.
I understand that, but I think this is not about. I think to be eligible to vote in a Scottish referendum ought not to be a test of ethnicity. It's about residency. And I think, I'm sure, I have family and friends who live overseas and who would like to be here to vote yes in October, November 2014, and who won't be. And I'm sure that's true of people who are on the other side of the argument. But I think the basis of the franchise for the referendum is agreed between the parties. OK, let's ask one question. Final question. It's about the question that goes in the paper. The proposal from the Scottish Government at the moment. Do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? It's faced some criticism that it may skew the way people answer if it starts with the words, do you agree, for instance. Now, here's a question from Keith from Edinburgh. If the Electoral Commission, which is looking at this question at the moment to see if it's fair, if it says that the question is biased and they support a change, will the Yes campaign, of which you're Chief Executive, agree with that change, or does the campaign follow what the SNP says only and support whatever the SNP wants? Well, the answer to the question is it will be a decision made in the Scottish Parliament. It will be for the Scottish Parliament to respond to the advice provided by the Electoral Commission, and that's where it will properly be determined. I would very much expect the Electoral Commission, with its experience and its record and its expertise, to come back with a very sensible response to its consultation. And I doubt in the end that this will actually prove something that's very difficult to resolve. I think the question is a fair question. If the Electoral Commission suggests any amendments to the question, I'm sure they'll produce very good evidence as to why they think
you'd go with the Electoral Commission, even if there's a majority to push it through at Holyrood.
What I've said about it, and it's an important point, because it's a point that's frequently made by Westminster governments, the Electoral Commission is advisory. Its advice is not mandatory. So I think it's a very important distinction. But at the end of the day, I think once the question is determined, and it will be, we begin a really interesting debate, which is what kind of country do you want Scotland to be? What kind of society do you want Scotland to be? I think that's where people will increasingly focus their attention.
Well, we've got quite a bit more of this to come. We could go on, but we're keeping this to a digestible online half hour. As I say, the debate will go on elsewhere. My thanks to Blair Jenkins for coming in, and to you, our viewers and online readers, for supplying these questions. You'll be able to put your questions to our future guests on this regular webcast. Join us for the next one on Friday, the 1st of February. In the meantime, if you want to find out more about the independence debate, go to bbc.co.uk/Scotland's Future. Till next time then, farewell.